had been looking for a way to disconnect for a while. Work had been stressful, and life in the city was slowly grinding me down. So when I found an old, rustic cabin available for last-minute booking deep in the mountains, I jumped at the opportunity. The listing was sparse, just a few photos of a small, weathered cabin surrounded by tall pines and wide open space. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, exactly what I needed to clear my mind. The drive there was longer than I expected, but the scenery was breathtaking. The further I got into the mountains, the fewer people I saw. There were no more houses or gas stations, just miles of winding road, dense forest, and jagged peaks. I finally reached the cabin just before sunset. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. Small, a little dilapidated, but charming. The kind of place you'd see in a movie when someone was trying to escape everything. There was a slight chill in the air, a hint of something fresh and wild that I hadn't felt in the city. Felt like a new start. I unloaded my car, set up in the cabin, and spent the evening just soaking in the peace. No traffic noise, no honking, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. I made myself some dinner, simple stuff, canned soup and crackers. I didn't mind. This was the life I'd been craving. I stayed up a little longer than usual, just watching the flames in the fireplace flicker and dance. There was something calming about the crackle of burning wood. It soothed me in a way that no city noise ever could. The first 2 days passed in a blur of relaxation. I went on hikes, explored the surrounding woods, and spent hours just sitting by the small lake nearby. The peace was almost too much to absorb, but I found myself growing more comfortable with it. There were no deadlines, no messages demanding a response. The silence was all-encompassing, and yet I felt oddly at home within it. On the third night, things began to feel different. Started as a subtle shift, so small that I almost didn't notice it at first. As I sat by the fire, reading a book, there was a slight change in the air. It wasn't the temperature, there was no chill, no breeze, but the atmosphere felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling lingered in the back of my mind. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was too used to the noise of the city and needed time to adjust to the silence. I went to bed later than usual, though I couldn't really explain why. As I lay there in the stillness, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, I had the strangest sensation. It wasn't the usual feeling of calm that had enveloped me over the past days. It was something else, something heavy, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong, but sleep refused to come. Then it happened. A small noise, like a twig snapping, came from outside the cabin. It was faint, but it was enough to make me freeze. I listened intently, but the forest outside was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to ignore it. But the noise came again, closer this time. I felt my heart begin to race. I sat up, trying to push the thoughts of anything sinister out of my mind. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to be active at night, and yet, there was something about the noise that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't random. It wasn't like an animal wandering around looking for food. It was too deliberate. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to calm down. I must have been imagining things. There was no reason to be afraid. The cabin was isolated, yes, but it was also in a place that should have been peaceful and safe. I turned over and closed my eyes, but my thoughts refused to quiet down. The noise was still there, like a low hum in the background of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. I didn't know how long I lay there, trapped in a state between wakefulness and sleep, but eventually, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a crack or snap from the forest. It was the unmistakable sound of something or someone walking, the soft rustling of feet against the underbrush, slow and deliberate. The sound grew closer, just beyond the walls of the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, but the anxiety in my chest was growing by the second. My instincts screamed at me to do something, to get up, to check, but I didn't move. The silence in the cabin was so thick, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then it stopped. The sound of footsteps ceased, and everything fell into an eerie stillness. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I was being suffocated by the quiet. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for the next sound. I don't know how long it was before I gathered enough courage to move, but when I did, I quietly swung my legs off the bed and stood up, creeping toward the window. The moonlight filtered through the trees outside, casting long, stretching shadows across the forest floor. I carefully peered through the curtain, trying to make out any movement. The world outside looked normal, too normal. Nothing. The rustling trees, the shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Nothing unusual, just the same quiet that had surrounded me for the past few days. I stepped back, relieved. Maybe I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination get the best of me. But before I could turn away from the window, something caught my eye. A shadow, at the edge of the trees, standing perfectly still, not moving. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but it was still there. A dark figure just beyond the tree lean, unmoving. For a moment, my heart stopped. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I froze, staring at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It was like it was waiting for something, or maybe waiting for me to make a move. My mind raced. Should I call someone? Should I go outside and confront it? But something in me, a deep instinct, told me not to. I stepped back from the window and quickly pulled the curtain shut, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was spinning. Was it a person? Was it just my imagination? Or was there something else out there? I moved to the other side of the cabin, trying to calm myself down, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and I could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread pressing down on me. The silence felt heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, now. But before I could make a move, I heard it again, the faintest noise. This time it was closer, right outside the cabin. The unmistakable sound of breathing. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly toward the window, my hands trembling. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to even look, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I slowly, quietly lifted the curtain again. This time there was no shadow. There was no figure standing still at the edge of the trees. Instead, there was a face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide, staring back at me. I didn't scream, couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart racing in my chest, but my body refusing to move. The face, if you could even call it that, was strange. The features were not quite right. Too pale, too gaunt, and the eyes, they were wide, almost unnatural in their intensity, like they were staring into my soul. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the face was gone. There was no sound, no movement. It was just gone. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what had just happened. I felt like I was caught in a nightmare, trapped in a place I couldn't escape from. Finally, I moved. I grabbed my keys, my phone, anything I could get my hands on, and I ran out of the cabin. My car was parked a few yards away, but I didn't look back. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to leave. The road twisted and turned as I sped away, and the darkness of the mountains swallowed the cabin from my view. I didn't stop until I was far enough away to feel safe, but the feeling of being watched, of that presence, never left me. Even now, I can't shake it. I can't forget the face. I never went back to that cabin. I never will. It had been years since I last stayed in the cabin. The snow was thick around the small house, blanketing the world outside in a heavy silence. I'd grown up here, spending winters in the mountains with my family, but this time, I was alone. The idea of being by myself didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed the solitude. It had been a long year, and the idea of getting away from everything, from work, from people seemed like exactly what I needed. The wind howled outside, battering the windows with snowflakes that turned the night into a blur of white. But inside, it was warm. The old wood stove crackled as it threw heat into the room, and the scent of burning pine filled the air. The cabin was small, but cozy, with thick wooden beams overhead and floors that creaked underfoot. The furniture was simple but functional. A small couch, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and an old oak table with mismatched chairs. It wasn't much, but it had everything I needed. I unpacked my things and settled into the familiar space. The place felt like home. I grabbed a book, poured myself a glass of wine, and let the hours slip by as I enjoyed the peace. But as the night wore on, I started noticing something strange. Little things at first. Nothing that seemed alarming, but enough to catch my attention. When I went into the kitchen to grab a snack, the chair at the table had been moved. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had bumped it earlier. After all, I had been a little distracted when I first arrived. The wind was fierce outside, and I hadn't even bothered to lock the door behind me when I entered. It was just me up here, and I'd always felt safe in this place. The idea of someone else being here was ridiculous. But then I walked into the living room and noticed something else. One of the pictures on the wall was crooked. I frowned. I was sure I hadn't noticed it being like that earlier, but I hadn't thought much about it when I first settled in. Maybe I'd knocked it out of place while bringing in my bags. But the more I looked around, the stranger it felt. I checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were all shut tight. There was no sign that anyone had been here. Still, something didn't sit right with me. I tried to push it aside. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was imagining things. The night stretched on, and I went to bed in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. The bed was soft, the blankets warm. I had spent so many nights in this room as a kid, and it had always felt like a safe place. But that night, it didn't. I felt like something was watching me, like something was just outside the door, lurking in the shadows. The wind rattled the windows, and the house creaked and groaned with every gust. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, hearing every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of the wind. Finally, I pulled the blankets off and got up to check the rest of the house. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I still had to look. The kitchen was empty, the chair back where it had been. The picture on the wall was still crooked, but nothing else seemed out of place. I checked the living room. The rocking chair was in the same spot, and the fire was still burning low. I walked around, opening the door to each room, checking every corner. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I finally returned to my room, feeling foolish. I checked the lock on the door again. It was secure. I checked the windows. They were locked tight. I turned off the lights and crawled back into bed, determined to get some rest. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something, a faint sound, just beyond the door. It was so quiet at first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, soft, slow, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped. The silence in the cabin was almost suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind playing tricks. But the footsteps didn't sound like the wind. They sounded deliberate, like someone was walking through the house. I got up again, heart pounding, and checked the door. The lock was still in place. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the hallway. The cabin was empty. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stepped into the hall. I moved quietly, as though if I made a sound, whoever was there would hear me. But there was nothing. Everything was still. The kitchen was empty. The living room, too. I checked every room again just to be sure, but I found nothing. No signs of anyone. No footprints in the snow outside. No clues as to who or what might have been walking around my cabin. The only thing that felt wrong was the silence. I returned to my bed and pulled the covers over my head, trying to calm my breathing. But sleep wouldn't come. Every small noise, every gust of wind against the walls, set my nerves on edge. Finally, I decided to get up one last time and check everything again. I don't know why I felt so compelled to do it, but I needed to be sure. I checked the front door, locked. I checked the windows, all secure. The fire in the stove was still burning low, the shadows dancing across the walls. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chair at the kitchen table was moved again. Not just slightly this time, but far enough that it couldn't have been me. And the picture on the wall? It was crooked again. But there was something else. The coat. My coat. The one I had hung on the hook by the door earlier was gone. I froze. I don't know what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. Someone had been here. Someone had been moving around the cabin while I was asleep. But how? The door was locked. The windows were secure. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. I rushed to the door and threw it open, half expecting to see someone standing on the porch. But there was nothing. No tracks in the snow. No sign of anyone. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The wind howled around me, the snow swirling in the air. But there was no one in sight. My coat was gone. The door had been locked, and there was no sign of anyone coming in or out. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the swirling snow. It felt like the cabin had swallowed up the night, like it had become something else, something I couldn't understand. The wind howled louder, the sound like a voice calling from the darkness, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I gathered what little I had left, grabbed my keys, and rushed to my car. My breath came out in clouds of steam as I started the engine, the heat slowly creeping back into my frozen fingers. I drove down the winding mountain road, not looking back. The cabin was just a blur in my rearview mirror, swallowed up by the darkness and snow. When I got back to town, I stopped at the first gas station I could find. The attendant looked at me strangely when I told him I'd been up at the cabin, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded. As I paid for the gas, I asked if he knew anything about the cabin. He shrugged. Not much. It's been abandoned for years, though. You're lucky you didn't end up trapped up there. There's no one else for miles. People talk about it being off, but it's just an old place, too far out for anyone to bother. I looked at him, a chill crawling up my spine. I had never felt that way about the cabin before, but now I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something had been there. Something had been moving around the house. I went home that night, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had happened in that cabin, it wasn't over. Something had been in that house, something that shouldn't have been, and it had followed me out of the mountains. And then the phone call came, the one that made everything clear. The cabin had burned down the following winter. We rented a cabin deep in the woods, just to escape for a weekend. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, leave behind the chaos, and spend a couple of days surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and peace. My partner and I had been talking about doing something like this for years, and finally, we found the perfect place. It was small, secluded, and located miles away from the nearest town, tucked between dense pines that blocked out any trace of the world beyond. The cabin itself was charming in its rustic simplicity. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a large front porch with rocking chairs, and a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. The whole place had an old-fashioned feel, like something you'd see in a postcard from the 70s. Everything looked well-maintained, though freshly painted, with the occasional squeak of the floorboards adding character. I loved it immediately. The first evening was beautiful. We lit a fire in the fireplace, unpacked our things, and spent the night sitting in front of the fire, drinking wine and talking about life. It was the perfect escape. No emails, no phones, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional call of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. We turned in early, both of us eager to make the most of the quiet morning we were going to have the next day. I remember waking up around midnight. It wasn't anything too strange. I just shifted in bed and found myself wide awake. The cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. My partner was still asleep next to me, breathing softly, and for a moment, I thought about going back to sleep. But then I heard it, a soft knock. It was faint, almost like the tapping of fingers on the door, too quiet to be sure. I lay there, motionless, listening. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, or maybe it was an animal clawing at the wood. It wasn't like the knock of a human. No, it was slow, almost delicate, and definitely not insistent. I tried to brush it off. It had been a long day of travel and nature hikes, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But then the knock came again, even softer this time, almost like a whisper against the door. Couldn't ignore it. I slowly sat up, careful not to disturb my partner. The room was still cold, but the fire had died down to embers. I could barely make out the shape of the furniture in the dim light. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. I checked the windows first, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the blackness of the forest beyond, with the occasional flicker of movement as a tree swayed in the wind. I checked the door locks. They were secure, and I had no reason to believe that anyone was out there. Yet, something about the sound of that knock made my skin prickle. It was like an invitation, something familiar, yet entirely unsettling. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. I could hear the wind picking up outside, but that soft knocking sound, it wouldn't stop. Came again, slow, quiet, almost too slow. Finally, I gathered the courage to open the door. I turned the handle slowly, every fiber of my being telling me to stop, to just lock the door and go back to bed. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was causing that noise. When I opened the door, I was expecting to see nothing but the empty porch, maybe some wildlife scurrying around or the remains of wind-blown branches. But there was something different. A piece of paper was pinned to the door with a small, rusty tack, fluttering in the wind. I felt my stomach drop. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me in sharp gusts, and reached for the paper. My hands shook as I grabbed it, tearing it slightly as I pulled it off the tack. The note was old. The ink was smudged in places, like it had been written hastily. It was crumpled, as if it had been in someone's pocket for days. I couldn't read the handwriting at first, but when I held it up to the light of the moon, I could make out the words, "It's your turn to knock." I stared at the note, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure what to make of it. My first thought was that it was a prank, but how could anyone have known we were here? This cabin was so far off the beaten path that the nearest neighbors were miles away. The ink was smudged in a way that didn't seem like modern-day handwriting, and the note itself looked old. Too old. I turned back to look at the dark expanse of the woods behind me. Everything was still. The cabin sat quietly in the night, and all I could hear was the wind whispering through the trees. I felt like I was being watched. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the anxiety clawing at my chest. It was just a prank, I told myself again. Maybe someone had come by earlier in the day while we were out hiking. Maybe it was one of the cabin owners, checking in on us for some reason. I couldn't think of any other explanation. The note had to be a joke. But as I stood there, holding the note, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The knocking had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And the fact that the note had appeared so suddenly, so quietly, made me uneasy. There was no sign of anyone around the cabin, no footprints in the dirt, no sign of any kind of disturbance. It was as if whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My partner was still asleep, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. I stared at the note in my hand for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The words, "It's your turn to knock," rattled in my mind. What did it mean? Who had left it? And why did I feel so uneasy, so exposed, even though nothing had happened? I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was being ridiculous. I folded the note up and shoved it into my pocket, then went back to bed. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every rustle of leaves outside seemed too close, too intentional. I pulled the blanket up around me, but it did little to comfort me. Every sound, the wind, the snap of twigs in the forest, made my heart race. The knock, the note, the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and still I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the windows, peering out into the blackness. There was nothing, no movement, no signs of anyone, but the nagging feeling didn't go away. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing outside, watching, waiting, and then it came again. The knock, slow, deliberate, almost as if it was counting down, waiting for me to answer. This time I didn't move. I didn't get up. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the soft, rhythmic tapping on the door. Felt like it would never stop. A minute passed, 2. Then there was a rustle in the bushes outside, followed by another tap on the door. It was softer this time, almost a whisper. I could hear it clearly now, like someone was standing right outside, just beyond the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over at my partner, who was still asleep. I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The knock, the note, the feeling of being trapped. I had to do something. I got up again, moving as quietly as I could, and went to the door. This time, I didn't open it immediately. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The knock had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unnerving. It was as if everything had gone still, as if the world had stopped moving altogether. I waited for what felt like forever. Nothing happened. The wind was picking up again, and I could hear the branches swaying in the trees. The knocking had stopped. Finally, I opened the door again, carefully this time. I stepped outside, scanning the area around the cabin. There was nothing, no one in sight, no sign of any movement. But then, I noticed something strange. A new note pinned to the door. This one was different. The handwriting was slanted and jagged, as if it had been written in a rush. I pulled it off the door and read it. It simply said, "It's time." I didn't hesitate this time. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat down against it, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my partner stirring in bed behind me, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know if it was real. The knocking stopped, and the silence was deafening. Morning came and we left. We packed our things quickly, checked out, and drove away without saying a word. I didn't look back, didn't stop until we were well out of the woods. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. All I know is that the knocking never came again after we left. The note stayed crumpled in my pocket, and I haven't dared to go back to that cabin. Sometimes, when I hear a soft knock on my door, I can't help but freeze. I had spent the weekend alone at the cabin, a small wooden structure nestled on the edge of a quiet lake. The kind of place where the only sounds you hear are the rustling of the trees, the occasional bird call, and the soft lapping of water against the shore. It was my retreat, my sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world. The noise, the demands, the endless barrage of things I needed to do. The first 2 days had been peaceful. I woke up late, made coffee by the fire, and spent hours walking around the woods surrounding the cabin. There was no one around for miles, and the isolation felt like a balm to my overworked mind. I didn't have to talk to anyone, didn't have to be anywhere. I could just be. On the last night, I decided to take a long bath to unwind before heading back to the real world. I filled the old clawfoot tub with warm water, the steam rising as I added some lavender-scented oil. It had been a while since I had done something so simple, so soothing, and I couldn't wait to sink into the water and let the tension drain out of my muscles. The bathroom was small, lit only by a single overhead light and the soft glow of a candle I had placed on the edge of the sink. I slid into the tub and let out a sigh, closing my eyes and resting my head on the edge. The heat of the water felt comforting, and I could hear the distant sound of a lone loon calling out over the water. It was peaceful, perfect, really. I was so immersed in the quiet of the moment that I didn't even realize how much time had passed. When I finally decided I'd had enough, I slowly lifted my head, stretching my arms out and reaching for the towel that was hanging on the rack just outside the tub. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, But when I looked up into the bathroom mirror, I saw a face. It wasn't mine. My heart stopped. The reflection wasn't a blur or a shadow. It was clear, unmistakable. The face was staring back at me, pale, expressionless, with dark eyes that were locked on mine. It wasn't the kind of thing you could dismiss as a figment of your imagination. It was there, solid, real. I spun around so fast that I almost slipped on the wet floor. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked frantically around the small bathroom. There was no one. The space was empty, and the sound of my own pulse thudded in my ears. The reflection was still there in the mirror, but now it was just a reflection. I couldn't understand it. Was I seeing things? Was it just a weird trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me? But I wasn't tired. I had been relaxed, calm, clear-headed. There was no reason for me to suddenly start hallucinating. I scrambled out of the bath, my feet slipping on the wet floor, and grabbed the towel, wrapping it around myself as I hurried out of the bathroom. I checked the rest of the cabin. Everything was fine. The living room, the kitchen, the small bedroom with its worn wooden furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. There was no one else in the cabin. The door was locked, the windows closed tight. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. But that didn't calm me. I locked every window and door, even double-checking the back door and the small side door that led to the shed. The latch clicked into place with an almost final sound. I turned off the lights and sat in the darkness, my hands trembling as I wrapped my arms around myself. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it had to be a mistake. My mind was just playing tricks on me. But as I sat there in the dark, my mind kept drifting back to that face in the mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The stillness of the cabin suddenly felt oppressive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to press in closer. The silence was too thick, too complete. Even the night sounds outside, usually comforting, seemed to fade into a strange hush. I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. I stayed there in the dark, feeling the tension grow with each passing minute. It was so quiet I could hear the steady beat of my own heart, my breath loud and uneven in the silence. I sat on the couch, staring at the fireplace, which had long since burned down to embers. The glow from the coals flickered, casting faint, erratic shadows on the walls. Then, just as I thought I might finally drift into sleep, I looked up and froze. The bathroom mirror. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at it. I hadn't even wanted to go near it, but somehow I found myself standing, drawn to it as if something was pulling me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crossed the room and walked into the bathroom. The mirror reflected the room in its usual way, but something was different. The face. It was there again, but now it was closer. The pale figure in the reflection was no longer just a blurry shape. It was clearer, sharper, more distinct. The dark eyes were locked on me, and this time they seemed almost alive. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The face was closer, too close, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were turning to jelly, and I reached out for the edge of the sink to steady myself. My mind raced, trying to explain what I was seeing, but no explanation made sense. I turned, desperate to look around the room. Again, no one was there. No sign of anyone. Nothing to explain the face. Nothing to explain how it was so clear, so close in the mirror. My pulse raced in my throat, the noise of it nearly deafening in my ears. I took a step back, my towel slipping off my shoulders as I backed away from the mirror. I could hear my breath coming fast, uneven, as if I couldn't get enough air. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. I stumbled over my own feet, my body moving in panic without thought, and I rushed back to the living room, locking the bathroom door behind me. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't stay in that cabin, alone with the reflection of something or someone who wasn't real, wasn't supposed to be there. The whole night felt like it stretched on forever. The silence of the cabin was unbearable, pressing in from every corner. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and no matter how much I tried to calm myself, the image of that face, so clear, so real, kept replaying in my mind. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wide awake, staring at the door to the bathroom, too terrified to sleep, too terrified to move. I didn't know if I was imagining things, if my fear had somehow manifested the face in the mirror, or if something was truly wrong with that cabin. The sun barely rose the next morning, and by the time the first light of dawn broke over the trees, I was already packed. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the cabin, and slammed the door behind me. The drive back home was a blur. I didn't stop, didn't think about anything except getting as far away from that cabin as possible. I didn't know what I had seen. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But as I drove, the memory of the face still lingered, sitting in the back of my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't want to, couldn't. There was something about it, something in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on, that made me never want to step foot there again. The truth is, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the quiet, the isolation had gotten to me more than I realized. But I do know one thing for sure. I never want to be alone in that cabin again. The face, the mirror, the feeling that something was watching me. It was too much. Whatever it wasn't a mistake. It was real, and I'm not going back to figure out what it meant. It was just me and my girlfriend, Emily. We decided to take a break from the usual grind, renting a small cabin for the weekend deep in the woods. The plan was simple: get away from everything, unwind, and spend time together without distractions. The cabin itself was secluded, nestled between a thick stretch of trees and miles away from the nearest neighbor. The air was fresh, crisp with the scent of pine and earth, and the sky above us was filled with stars like a canvas of light. We had no real expectations, but that was part of the charm. We were going to enjoy the isolation. The first night was exactly as we had hoped. We spent the evening sitting by the fire pit, drinking wine and talking. It felt good to just relax, especially after a stressful few months. We made up silly games, laughed over memories, and just let the quiet of the woods surround us. The fire crackled in the pit, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the chill creeping in from the woods around us. The night felt perfect. Eventually, the wine began to take its toll, and we decided to head inside. The cabin was small, just one main room with a loft above it. A rustic, cozy place, but enough for the two of us. The main floor had a couple of chairs, a small table, and a stone fireplace that still smelled faintly of the firewood from earlier. The loft was little more than an attic, with no real walls separating it from the open space below. There was a small ladder leading up to it, but no other rooms, no furniture, just empty space. We climbed into bed, the sheets cool against our skin. I was drifting off, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside lulling me into a sense of comfort. But then I heard it, a soft sound, almost like the shuffle of someone walking lightly. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, the natural creaks and groans of an old cabin. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, the faintest rhythm of footsteps pacing across the floor above us. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the aftereffects of the wine. But as I lay there, listening, I realized something unsettling. The footsteps weren't in the other room. They were right above me, above our bed. They were close, too close. My heart rate picked up. I turned to look at Emily, hoping she hadn't heard it too. But when I turned my head, I froze. She was already awake, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. She didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stared, listening. After a long moment, she whispered, barely audible, "You hear that too, right?" I didn't say anything, but I nodded. I couldn't bring myself to speak. The footsteps above us continued, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking back and forth, pacing in a rhythm that made no sense. The house settled and creaked, but this was different, intentional, purposeful. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or the wind shifting something upstairs. I told myself that, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the sound of paws or shifting wood. It was the sound of human footsteps, soft and heavy in a way that made my skin crawl. The pacing continued for what felt like an eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever was up there knew we were listening. I reached over, gently placing my hand on Emily's arm. She didn't react. Her body was stiff, still. Her eyes stayed locked on the ceiling, and the corners of her mouth tightened. Her breath was shallow, almost imperceptible. I pulled my hand back, suddenly unsure if I should be comforting her or if I should be running. I considered getting up, looking for a flashlight, but the thought of moving in the darkness felt impossible. The footsteps were unnerving, but what bothered me more was that they were coming from a place that should have been impossible for anyone to walk in. The attic above us wasn't a proper floor. It was just beams and thin planks of wood, not meant for anyone to walk on. There was no space to move up there, no real way for someone to pace in that confined space. The idea that someone was up there, someone who shouldn't be, was enough to send a shiver through my spine. I pulled the covers tighter around us, hoping the feeling would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps didn't stop. The pacing continued, and as I lay there, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched from above. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of it, but no logical explanation came to mind. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence fell over the cabin. The wind had died down outside, and even the usual creaks and groans of the house seemed to hold their breath. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to roll over, close my eyes, and let sleep take over again. But I couldn't. The silence felt suffocating, like something was waiting, just beyond reach. We lay there in the darkness for what seemed like hours, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The exhaustion from the day, mixed with the unsettling tension in the air, finally overcame me. My sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams and waking moments where I thought I heard the footsteps again. But each time I opened my eyes, there was nothing, just the quiet. Morning came slowly, the weak light of dawn creeping through the cabin's small windows. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside and the distant rustling of leaves. The peaceful sounds of the forest didn't quite match the knot in my stomach. Emily was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful, though I noticed the subtle tension in her jaw. She hadn't said much after the footsteps stopped, but I could feel the unease radiating off her. I got up carefully, trying not to disturb her. The cabin was still, but my eyes couldn't help but be drawn to the loft above us. I hadn't thought about it much in the night, but now, in the light of day, I realized something. The attic had no tracks, no signs of disturbance, no footprints in the dust, nothing. I walked over to the ladder leading up to the loft, my feet heavy on the floorboards. I peered up into the attic, but all I could see was the beam structure and empty space. There were no signs that anyone or anything had been up there at all. No sign of movement, no marks in the dust or dirt that had settled in the corners of the small space. The wood was pristine, untouched, as if nothing had ever been up there. I stared at the attic for a long time, trying to make sense of it. My mind refused to accept what had happened, but the evidence was clear. The footsteps had come from above us, from a place where no one could have been. But there was no trace, no sign of anyone. I turned to look at Emily, who had stirred in the bed, rubbing her eyes. She sat up, glanced at me, and then back up at the attic. "Do you think?" she began, her voice hesitant. "Do you think we're alone here?" I didn't know how to answer her. My mouth was dry, my thoughts scattered. I wanted to reassure her, to say something that would make everything feel normal again. But nothing felt normal. There was no explanation for what we'd heard, no explanation for what I'd felt. We left the cabin shortly after that, neither of us willing to stay a moment longer. The rest of the weekend was a blur, filled with awkward silence and unspoken thoughts. We didn't talk much on the drive home, and when we finally reached the city, we both felt a weight lift, but the unease lingered. Neither of us ever mentioned the footsteps again. As the weeks went on, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself, or the wind. Maybe the old building had settled, making strange noises. But deep down, I knew I couldn't explain it. Not fully. The pacing had been too deliberate, too human in its rhythm. And when I thought about the attic, how pristine it had been, how untouched, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something that hadn't left a trace. The cabin had been abandoned for years, the kind of place that didn't seem to welcome anyone. It sat in the mountains, far enough from civilization that the road to it was little more than a faint trail overgrown with brush and weeds. The structure was sagging, the windows cracked, and the porch had collapsed in on itself. Yet, despite all this, my friends and I had decided it was the perfect spot to camp out for the weekend. We'd been out hiking all day, and by the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, and we were all exhausted. There was no way we were going to set up tents after the day we'd had. When we first arrived, the place gave off an unsettling vibe. The air inside felt stale, like it hadn't been touched in decades, thick with dust and the smell of decaying wood. We stepped cautiously inside, careful not to disturb too much of the dust as we took in our surroundings. It looked like no one had lived there in years, maybe longer. The furniture, if you could even call it that, was old and falling apart, with one chair tipped over in the corner. The fireplace was cold, the hearth empty, but the stone walls still had a strange warmth to them, as if they were holding on to some forgotten memory. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, even the windows, which were so dirty that it was almost impossible to see anything outside. Despite how creepy the place felt, we were desperate to get out of the cold. We decided to light a fire and make some dinner. The fire crackled to life with the dry wood we had found in the back of the cabin, and the room was filled with its flickering light. We set up our sleeping bags, spread out the food we'd packed, and sat around the warmth of the fire. The conversation flowed easily at first, just a bunch of friends joking around, talking about how we'd never come back to this cabin again. But as the night wore on, that strange feeling settled deeper into my chest. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, when something isn't quite right but you can't put your finger on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was somehow alive with its own presence. It wasn't a ghostly presence, but something heavier, darker. My friends didn't seem to notice it, though. They laughed, they talked, they made plans for tomorrow. But I couldn't focus on anything except the creeping unease that filled the space. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the setting, this old, decrepit cabin in the middle of nowhere. But the longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. After a while, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. I wandered around the cabin, hoping that maybe some fresh air outside would clear my head. I stepped onto the porch, and the night air hit me like a wall. It was sharp, cold, and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. The mountain forest stretched out before me, the trees standing like silent sentinels under the moonlight. I felt a moment of peace out there, but it didn't last long. The feeling from inside the cabin seemed to follow me, wrapping itself around my chest, making it hard to breathe. I turned back to the cabin and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A door, tucked away in the back corner of the cabin. It was half hidden behind a pile of old blankets and discarded furniture. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to call to me. It was strange, almost as if the cabin was asking me to look inside. The door was locked, but there was something about it that intrigued me. I walked over to it, my hand brushing against the rough wood as I ran my fingers along the frame. There was a rusted handle, and despite the obvious wear, it felt solid under my touch. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, and I didn't have a key. I backed away from it, feeling an inexplicable pull to the door, an urge to open it, to see what was behind it. But I turned around and rejoined my friends by the fire. They were laughing about something, but I couldn't focus on their conversation. All I could think about was that door, that locked room at the back of the cabin. It was as if something was drawing me to it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was inside. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the thought stayed with me, nagging at the back of my brain. When my friends eventually fell asleep, I found myself lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire. The cabin was completely silent, but my mind was racing. I tried to ignore the temptation, tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of my sleeping bag, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy with the weight of something I couldn't name. Finally, after what felt like hours, I made up my mind. I grabbed the crowbar I had noticed earlier in the corner of the room, hidden under a pile of rotting wood. The old metal felt cold in my hands as I crept back to the door. The others were fast asleep, oblivious to my actions. I carefully pried the crowbar between the frame and the door, and with a bit of effort, it gave way. The lock snapped open with a slow creak, and I pushed the door inward. The room inside was completely empty, save for one thing. A stack of old, dusty journals lay in the far corner, stacked neatly on a table, as if they had been placed there recently. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease as I approached the table. The journals were yellowed with age, their spines cracked and fragile. I picked up the top one, flipping through the pages. The handwriting inside was neat but hurried, as though whoever had written it had been afraid they might run out of time. The entries in the journals were mostly mundane, little notes about daily life in the cabin, what they had eaten, how the weather had been, small details of the routine. But then I reached the final entry, dated 1973. The handwriting in that entry was different. It was frantic, the words almost illegible in places. "They heard me. They're coming for me." I froze. The words seemed to echo in my mind, repeating over and over. I couldn't understand it. Who were they? Why had this person written these words? I felt my heart begin to race, and a chill ran down my spine. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing against me as I stood there, staring at the page. My fingers trembled as I set the journal down. I couldn't stop myself from glancing nervously over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me. But no one was there. I grabbed the other journals and flipped through them quickly, but none of them contained anything as chilling as the last one. The last entry, though, had been enough. I stood there in the dark room, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just read. I wanted to leave, to forget about the cabin and everything inside it, but I couldn't. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't stop the unease that was crawling under my skin. I shoved the journals back onto the table, my mind racing. I stepped quickly out of the room, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. I barely slept the rest of the night, the words from the journal echoing in my head. "They're coming for me." In the morning, I didn't say anything to my friends. They were in good spirits, laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. We packed up our things and left the cabin behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us as we left. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, I took one last look back at the cabin. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, so quiet, as though nothing had ever happened there. But I knew better now. I knew something had happened, and whatever it was still there, buried deep in the walls of that old cabin, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. I didn't go back to that cabin. I didn't even tell my friends what I had found. They wouldn't have believed me. They would have brushed it off as my imagination running wild. But I know what I read in those journals, and I'll never forget the last words in that final entry. "They're coming for me," and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere, still watching. The cabin was tucked away in a small, isolated corner of the woods, far from the chaos of the city. It was exactly what I needed, peace and solitude. The kind of quiet that allows your thoughts to settle, where the only sound you could hear was the wind rustling through the trees or the occasional chirp of crickets at night. It had been a long time since I'd taken a break, and I figured a week in the woods would give me the space I needed to unwind. I was alone, just me and the wilderness. The cabin itself was modest but cozy, nestled under a canopy of towering pine trees. There was a front porch with a wooden swing, which I immediately fell in love with. It was old, the paint peeling in spots, but that just added to its charm. I spent my evenings there, sitting in the swing, gently rocking back and forth, with a cold drink in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of the wood as it swayed beneath me. It was peaceful, too peaceful at times. There was a certain stillness in the air that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar quiet of being so far from civilization. On the second day, I took a long walk through the woods, hoping to get my bearings and take in the scenery. The forest was dense and green, the scent of pine needles heavy in the air. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the underbrush and the occasional bird call. The farther I walked, the more I felt a strange sense of isolation, like I was being watched. But when I returned to the cabin, I shook off the feeling. I figured it was just my imagination. I had never spent much time alone in the woods before, and my mind was likely playing tricks on me. The next few days passed uneventfully, with me mostly keeping to myself. The nights were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. On the third night, I went outside after dinner to relax on the porch swing, just like I had every evening before. The air was cool and crisp, the sky clear, the stars visible above. I let the swing move gently, rocking back and forth, my feet lightly grazing the wooden floorboards. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. But then I heard it, the unmistakable creak of a swing. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe the wind had picked up, and the swing was moving more than usual. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, like someone was sitting in it and rocking back and forth. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The porch only had one swing. I knew this, and yet there it was, the sound of another swing moving. I stood up, my legs stiff, and stepped to the edge of the porch, my eyes scanning the yard. The wind had picked up, but there was nothing else out there. No one, just the dark expanse of the woods stretching out before me. I looked back at the swing, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw the chains shifting, like the swing was still moving, even though no one was there. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't bring myself to. I just stood there, staring at the swing, trying to make sense of it. It was just the wind, right? It had to be. But as I looked, the swing stopped moving. There was no more creaking, no more movement. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that made my skin crawl. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but finally, I forced myself to walk back inside the cabin. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered, heavy in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't ignore what I had heard. I tried to distract myself, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying the sound in my mind, the eerie creak of the swing that hadn't been there before. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or had something else happened out there? The night dragged on, and I finally managed to fall asleep, though it wasn't a restful one. My dreams were fragmented and restless, filled with vague images of the cabin and the swing, of something moving just out of sight, always just out of reach. The next morning, I woke to a strange feeling. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as I moved toward the kitchen, I froze. The swing was facing the wrong way. I hadn't turned it before I went inside. I distinctly remembered it facing the other direction when I left the porch the night before. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. It was facing the far side of the porch now, the chains taut, as if it had been deliberately turned while I was inside. I stepped out onto the porch, my legs shaky, and approached the swing. I looked around again, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been near the cabin. Just the quiet, still morning air. I reached out and touched the seat of the swing, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath my fingers. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to look beneath the porch to check for something, anything that could explain it. Maybe there was something simple, a breeze, a shift in the way the cabin settled overnight. But when I knelt down and peered underneath the porch, there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows and old cobwebs. My heart raced, and I pulled myself up, standing there, staring at the swing, feeling a deep, unsettling chill creeping through me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong. This wasn't just my imagination. Something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, lying in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound the cabin made. The wind outside whistled through the trees, and the occasional branch would tap against the window, but nothing else. When morning came, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about the way the swing had moved, the way it had been turned overnight, didn't sit right. I decided that I'd had enough. I wasn't going to stay another night in the cabin. I packed my things quickly, grabbing whatever I could, and rushed out to my car. As I started the engine, I looked back at the cabin, my eyes drawn to the porch. The swing was still there, facing the wrong way. I don't know why I looked back, but something compelled me to. The cabin, the porch, the swing, they all felt like they were watching me, waiting for me to leave. I drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me as the trees closed in around it. I couldn't explain what had happened there, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never return. As the road stretched out ahead of me, the silence in the car felt overwhelming, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't oppressive or suffocating, like the silence in the woods. It was a quiet that I could breathe in, a relief. I don't know what caused the swing to move that night, or why it had been turned when I woke up. I'll never know, but I do know that I wasn't alone in that cabin. Something was there, something I couldn't see, something that had been watching, waiting, and I never planned on finding out what.